sailcloths, that may be different in 20 minutes than it is right now. So you should please feel free to get up and shift about to make yourself comfortable, to sit in the shade, be sure to drink your water, all of those things. If you're a longtime guest of the festival, you'll know that the Seminar Grove used to be a grove of trees. It's moved across the street here. They're still working on the shade, and a new design of sailcloths will be coming a bit later in the summer. It's on the way, but it's not here yet. So sorry about that. But so we're still working in learning to use this beautiful new space that opened last year, and we're really excited to be here. I'm going to introduce myself. Let my partner introduce herself, and then we're going to introduce you to our very special guest today. My name is Kate McPherson, and I am an English professor and the honors program director up the road a few hours at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. I have been lucky enough to be coming to this festival since I took my job at UVU in the year 2000, so 17 years of coming to the festival. But this is my first year as part of the staff here, and I'm really excited to be here with my seminar co-leader.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kate Moncrief. So Kate and Kate show in the morning. If you yell Kate, one of us is going to answer your question. I am a professor and the chair of English at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland, across the country from here. But I've also been coming to this festival for quite a long time because my best friend and longtime scholarly collaborator, Kate McPherson, lives in Utah. So she and I've collaborated for 22 years. We met as young graduate students at the Folger Shakespeare Library. We've written 3 books together, and we're really thrilled to have this opportunity to work together here this summer. How many of you have been to the festival before? Great, 56th
Welcome.
season. Any newcomers this morning?
Any brand new folks? There we had just a couple in the first session. Well, spread the word and tell your friends. That we're really glad to have new people here. And one of the new people we have with us here is Peter Rothstein, who is our director for Guys and Dolls. And so in the first week of the previews and at the opening, yay, we're lucky enough to have these chief artistic staff here with us to answer questions about the play. Kate and I really look forward to learning a lot from Peter about the show. Kate and I are Shakespeare scholars, but we're theater enthusiasts. Kate particularly is a big fan of the musical, and I through the positive influence of my spouse and now my daughter, who apple didn't fall far from the tree, she's in the theater, have grown to love this peculiarly wonderful American dramatic form of the musical. And so we're really looking forward to talking about Guys and Dolls today. So I'm going to give you guys just a little bit of factoid stuff because as a professor, I can't help myself. I learned this, and I didn't know this. I'm not a scholar of American literature. And so Guys and Dolls, as are many musicals, based on, a contemporary, near contemporary piece of literature. There was a writer named Runyon in the 1930s, and he was as popular in his own time as Charles Dickens was in Victorian London. He was a best-selling short story writer. He was actually a journalist who moved into writing fiction. And so he worked for Hearst newspapers and it covered human interest stories, but also a big sports writer. So he, wrote about every World Series, and he was in the room at the Lindbergh trial. And so he wrote these stories. But one of the peculiar things about him is that he started writing these tales of New York that featured gangsters, and actually was personal friends with many people who were part of the criminal underworld in that time period. He thought that regular people were boring, basically.
Well, this is a boy from Kansas, right? Yeah. Who moved to New York at 26. I am a girl from Nebraska. And, that allure of New York, my first trip to New York, he became involved with all of these really famous people and with these gangsters and that sort of allure of that culture. Yeah. He was really struck by that.
Yeah. And so you want to think about that the vision we have of the American gangster is something that he helped create. And so shows like, for instance, Sopranos or films like The Godfather probably wouldn't exist without the influence of the man who wrote the stories upon which Guys and Dolls is based. There's a story called The Idyll of Sarah Brown that's the primary source for this story. And Runyon was such a fascinating guy. For instance, he met Pancho Villa while he was covering spring training in Texas.
Baseball, right?
Yeah. And he was a notorious gambler himself and a heavy drinker, and apparently such a notorious gambler that when he was going to bet on a horse race, he would place two bets. He would place one bet on the horse that he thought would win and one bet on the horse that he thought would lose, just so that
all the horses, actually.
all
He'd
the
place a
horses.
small bet on all the horses.
So-
He so hated to feel like a loser. He'd place a big bet on the one he hoped would win, but a small bet on every other horse so he could be a winner no matter what.
Right.
It's great.
So we have Runyon, the background on Runyon, this fascinating guy who inspired the world of the musical, but that world was really crafted by Frank Lesser, and then two other writers, Joe Swirling and Abe Burrows. And Lesser, you might know, for instance, as the author of the song "Baby It's Cold Outside," or also who wrote the music for "How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying." And Hans Christian Andersen, apparently, which I don't have in my notes. That's great. And so the musical initially premiered in 1950 at the 46th Street Theater, which is now the Richard Rogers Theater. It did 1,200 performances and netted more than $12 million.
Big hit.
It was a big hit. It won all the major Tony Awards when it first premiered, and many people consider it to be the perfect musical piece of musical theater. There's so much about it that is iconic and so tightly structured. And so we're really looking forward to talking with Peter about the play and answering your questions along the way there.
We should also note that this was going to be awarded the Pulitzer Prize for drama.
Oh, right.
But in fact, it was not awarded that year because of connection with the McCarthyism and the House
Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah. So the Pulitzer was actually withheld. This is probably familiar to many of you. You've heard the music. It has had many, many revivals. I mean, it's revived constantly. Although my colleague Jason Rubin, who is a scholar of the American musical, says to me, "We're ripe for another." So Utah's doing it here. This is one that is very familiar.
And one more tidbit maybe before we turn to Peter is we're all as attendees here at the Utah Shakespeare Festival pretty familiar with the way that Shakespeare helped shape the English language. We should also give credit to Runyon for that. And so there are a number of phrases from his work that have become part of the American vernacular. I got a list of them here. Phrases like "no dice" or "in spades" or "to give someone the heave-ho." That's all Runyon. And we get that in Guys and Dolls. So we're really excited to talk about that.
Yeah, to speak like a Runyon character, no contractions, the kind of gangster talk that we think about. He developed that. I think an interesting way to think about it, Shakespeare writes in heightened language, oftentimes in verse, but when the characters speak in prose, we're still talking about heightened language. Runyon also uses a kind of peculiar and heightened language in his speech. So we're going to turn to the director. We're going to talk with him a little bit, and then we're going to solicit your questions and your feedback as well. But would you mind starting us out? This is such a familiar musical, right? This is like coming to one of the Shakespeare giant plays, and we have many received ideas of what we've seen and heard. Could you talk about a little bit about your concept for this particular production, and how does one deal with, climbing a mountain like Guys and Dolls to make it your own?
It's a great question. Is this working? No? Okay. It's interesting. I have a small company in the Twin Cities where I'm located, and actually what we do is reimagine work from the canon. So
it's called Theater Latte Da.
Theater Latte Da. And for example, we just did a ragtime that was originally had 48 people in it. We did it with 11 people and a bare stage. We did a gypsy with a cast of 12 and about 50 bentwood chairs, otherwise no scenery. So we often are reimagining work from the musical theater canon. With Guys and Dolls, to be honest, I think it's a work that does not want a heavy concept put on top of it for a couple of reasons. I think one, it's perfect. It is a perfect musical comedy. Number two, it is a world unto itself. And the goal should be to figure out how to capture what's singular about that world. Because what Runyon created is a world unlike any other world. You can actually, I don't even think, go to like a movie or as we were working, Kevin Alberts, our fabulous costume designer, is here. As we were working on what the world is, what the palette is, what the line of it is, I couldn't say it is this artist. I couldn't say it is this movie. because it is so singular. It's so unique unto itself. We certainly look to artists. Edward Hopper was an influence with palette for this production. I loved what Hopper does with color and light, but also what Hopper does with what's private space and what's public space is really interesting in Hopper artwork. And this musical has really, I think, interesting dynamics of private moments happening in public spaces, which we see quite a bit in Edward Hopper's paintings. Also, there was an WPA artist who got in all sorts of trouble, Paul Cadmus, a gay painter who was very much interested in the underbelly of New York. He created a series of paintings called The Fleet's Inn that was commissioned by the U.S. Military to hang in in one of the military academies, and ended up being edited and removed from the academies for its depiction of the underbelly of New York. As a result, it ended up on the front page of the New York Times, and more people ever saw it than it had not been edited in the first place. So Robert Mapplethorpe, 60 years earlier. So we certainly looked for inspiration, but the goal here was not to create a concept that we laid on top of it, but to actually get inside of it and figure out how to create this world as specifically, as uniquely as possible. And then the goal was really how to balance. I've done this piece once before, to be honest, at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle, a huge 2,800 seat theater, big house.
Big house.
And the danger that I encounter with this piece is it's so easy to just play the style, because the style is so delicious and enticing, that you actually don't play the humanity and the human stakes of the story. Because it is about people who are polar opposites, who have completely antithetical ethical standards, ideas of what men are and what women are, and yet these opposites somehow find a way to not just coexist, but actually to marry. And in 2017, I don't think that's a bad lesson for us to look at, right? Our society becomes more and more polar opposite. So how do we coexist?
A couple things to think about. I was really struck by the color palette. So our costume designer, really beautiful. Runyon was described during the time period as dressing like a peacock. That's a quote that someone said. So I was thinking about Runyon himself dressing like a peacock in this really beautiful color palette. I think one of the things that makes this musical so perfect as well, we can probably all think of musicals where we love the music, but the book's not very interesting or very good, and we can remember the music. Here, the book is as good as the music, the story, the characters, the depth, the humanity, and the fact that you were thinking so much about that, these particular storylines. We were just talking about As You Like It, right? So courtship and marriage, and will these couples get together? This author sets up those kinds of questions. There are stakes involved for these human characters in this particular musical, a little bit like Shakespeare. There are stakes involved.
Right. This musical, Guys and Dolls, has a subtitle, and it's called A Musical Fable of Broadway. And so I wanted to let Peter talk about that idea of the subtitles. As a teacher, you can always mine the subtitle of a text. And so
Twelfth Night, or What You Will.
That's right. So subtitles, they're a thing.
I think fable, right, is that key word, right? Is that it's once removed, it's heightened, it's theatrical, it's overt in its storytelling, right?
And it has a moral, a lesson.
Exactly. So when I think of a fable, right, there's an intention behind the storyteller. And so one way that that perhaps is unique to this production is how we begin each act. And for those who have seen it, there's a trio of characters. I was struck when I first started working on this production a number of years ago that the piece opens with a staged overture in a way, right? It's called Runyon Land, which was revolutionary in its day, to put what would be the ballet from European opera, that Act 3 slot, to move it to the top of the evening. So he was pretty radical there, opening this show with a staged overture, essentially. And then you go to a trio of characters, Rusty Charlie, Benny Southstreet, Nicely Nicely Johnson, and they pop out throughout the show, but they aren't our principal characters. They aren't. We aren't on their quest. It's not their "I Want" song. So it's actually we don't actually get to our primary characters singing till quite late in the evening. We're about 20 minutes in before we actually hear vocally, musically from our primary characters. And I was struck by how this piece starts with this trio of men, and then what happens in the original production is Rusty Charlie just goes away, and it becomes Benny and Nicely reappear throughout, and the number Guys and Dolls is just a duet. And that always struck me a bit odd. And then I was watching the movie, and they actually turned the title song Guys and Dolls into a trio. Uh, Perhaps because Frank Sinatra was playing Nathan Detroit, and he was not going to do the movie if he wasn't singing the title song. I don't know if that's true, but I can imagine that being a story.
Yes, right?
So I thought, well, that, and it's interesting because that song is actually written as a trio. Structurally, it's three stanzas and a refrain. So we've reconstructed our work to have that trio omnipresent, who begins the evening with Fugue for Tin Horns, and then the three of them sing Guys and Dolls, and they stay a unit throughout the evening. But because I was struck by them having this opening number, which, to be honest, has nothing to do with the essential plot of the show. It's Fugue for Tin Horns. They're bookies. They're navigating, placing bets. And I thought for a long time, why is it that this song, it doesn't start out with "Here we are on Broadway" or "Meet Nathan," "Meet Adelaide," or it starts out with, but the whole plot is based upon a bet. The entire construct is placed upon a bet. So opening the evening with three bookies placing bets is kind of a great metaphor for what's going to be our engine throughout the evening. And so I was interested in this idea of fable is, are there storytellers? Is there someone who has a different relationship with the audience than our primary characters? And it seems like those three were the logical ones. And so we also had a scenario where we were needing to use recorded music in the production this year for a number of reasons, which we don't need to go into, but we're using a recorded orchestra. The fabulous thing is we have the best players in the country recording our orchestra. We went to Milwaukee and brought in all these Chicago musicians. So we still created our own orchestration. It's just recorded. But it's really important to me as a director that we tell the truth, and that that's the ultimate goal in the rehearsal process, is to make those characters tell the truth, to be honest. And I didn't want to start our theatrical event with a lie in a way and play an overture assuming there was an orchestra in the pit down there when there isn't. And so I wanted to figure out a clever way to kind of tell people it's a recording. So our production begins with the trio bringing a record player on stage, selecting the record of Guys and Dolls, putting on the record, and with the downbeat of Runyon Land, we enter the theatrical world. And then we do a little kind of shtick with that at the top of Act 2 as well. But the goal of that was to tell the truth. But also, I think it makes sense in that notion of a fable of who are our storytellers, who has a relationship with the audience that's different from the other characters.
Right.
Because you talk about the minor characters, and starting with the minor characters, this is a fully developed and fully realized world, right? We have very specific characters. You know, just a funny little story here. My partner as a young actor played Harry the horse. So when I was prepping, we were having a joke. He says, well, so when you talk to the audience there, you should really talk about how Guys and Dolls is the journey of Harry the horse. you know, so every actor really has something really meaty and something really specific about those characters, in the way that Shakespeare also gives us really specific characters. If you saw As You Like It, William has just only a moment on stage, but he's very specific. So Runyon creates this whole world, and I think starting there, immersing us in that world, is quite wonderful.
It's like if you are going to get to see Shakespeare in Love, which I certainly hope you are, there's that hilarious bit that Stoppard makes fun of in the screenplay, I mean, and in the script of the play also, is that they're in the tavern, and the tavern wenches are sitting around with the men who are going to be in the company, sits down on Ralph's lap and says, so what's this play about? And he goes, so there's this nurse. You're talking about Romeo and Juliet. So it's that same kind of thing there. So so that's, I think, a really wonderful bit. these minor characters that you've chosen to have them as the storytellers. Did you saw the show yesterday? Most of you, yeah. Did you get the joke, the shtick in the second act with what record they dropped first? The Mary Poppins. Yeah, which was of course the show that was staged here last year. So I thought that was very clever. That vintage piece there. Yeah.
The only lie is Guys and Dolls was originally recorded on a 68 album. And Mary Poppins was not. It was recorded on 72. Is that what? Am I getting the numbers right? 78. Yeah.
78.
Yeah.
78.
So we cheated there a little.
The little one. Right. So we're almost ready to turn to the audience.
Let me ask
One more question.
Question for our director. So minor characters are a lot of fun, but our major characters, I think something that also links us with Shakespeare, and perhaps As You Like It, is change and transformation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that with our major characters, perhaps with Skye, with Sarah, with Nathan, with Adelaide.
Sure. I think it's such a big question.
I know,
Pick one character.
I think there's a really great book that just came out. I believe it's called The Making of a Broadway Musical. Jack Vertel, who's a Broadway producer, Broadway dramaturg, has been working on Broadway musicals for half a century, just published a book, and it's all about the dramaturgy of the American musical. And he spends a lot of time talking about Guys and Dolls. But he makes several points in there which I think are interesting about what a 1950s audience, how they would have responded to the gender politics of the piece. And that a 1950s audience, the idea of a woman domesticating a man was a ripe joke throughout the 40s and early 50s. And so that all of it drives to a duet between the two women, which is Marry the Man Today and Change His Ways Tomorrow, is a central hook, that would have just been a sweet spot around gender sense of humor at that time. So we tried to both be honest to the time in which it was written, but also understand that we have different ideas of what a woman and a man and how they can coexist in 2017 is. And so our title song, for example, Guys and Dolls, the dramaturg and I were going at it, and every time we were watching a run through, we thought, oh, it sounds like these guys are actually quite misogynistic. They're actually, sounds like they're making fun of women. And that's not what the song that is doing at all. It's actually making fun of men who get whipped by, fall in love with the women, and they're no longer the swinging bachelors that their friends want them to be. And so we decided with these three characters that you have those college friends, and there's the one guy who never quite gets married, and he mourns as each friend is married off, that the three of these are actually the three who probably couldn't get married if they wanted to. That
doesn't Sondheim play with that in Company?
He certainly does.
That story
certainly does. And so really trying to finesse that number in such a way that it's about how these three men are mourning the fact that all of their bachelor friends are getting married off, and seeing how the men change when women enter their life. And so certainly Skye and Sarah, everyone needs to change in order to figure out how to cohabitate, but that we spent, I guess, in some ways that plays itself throughout the piece. And we spent more time in 2017 figuring out how does the gender representation feel respectful, and have those characters still be honest with what we know about men and women in 2017.
Thank you. All right. Well, so we want to turn to the audience, and there was a lady here who wanted to get started.
Didn't know if I was going to talk on this. We saw Guys and Dolls yesterday afternoon, and I was just kind of surprised about the audience response to Nicely Johnson. It felt to me like he had as much enthusiasm from the audience as the main characters, and I just wondered if he expected that, or if you expected that prior to, I guess tomorrow was your first audience show, is that correct?
Yesterday was our first audience, yeah.
So was that expected?
Yeah, so Nicely Johnson is one of the trio, in this production, one of our narrators, I suppose. He has the song Sit Down, You're Rockin' the Boat. And that That song is the 11 o'clock number. Interesting. Also comes from a secondary character, not from one of our primary characters, but it's the showstopper at the 11 o'clock hour. Um, and um, you know, I think if people don't fall in love with Nicely Nicely Johnson, you haven't done your job. Because he does get that slot. He gets the showstopper in Act Two, and so he doesn't have a lot of material. He doesn't have a lot of lines. But how do you make sure the audience falls in love with him and that he earns that moment?
Wears a cute red hat.
Where's a cute red hat?
Yeah, he's a rich character. You've done
Oh,
so much to
absolutely.
make him into this person that, and just like the name itself, we're compelled by the name to be attracted to him. How can you not want to pay attention to somebody who introduces themselves as nicely? It's impossible.
We actually, you know, we really honored this piece. We didn't, other than making the duets into trios, and that, you know, we're doing it word for word.
Yeah.
The only changes we made were Big Julie right before "Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat" says, "Get up, you big fat water buffalo," and the word "fat," every time we heard it, it felt wrong to us, and we felt like the audience might. And I talked to Reg about it, who's a bigger guy.
He's a big guy.
And he was cool with it, but I feel like the audience left the play because they were feeling something for the actor, not the character in that moment. So we changed to "you big water buffalo" rather than the word "fat." And then early in the piece, Nathan, in the first scene, he says, "What am I, a sex maniac?" And we cut the word "sex" because it just took us to a weird place to our ear in 2017 that I don't think is what the original writers intended. And so we cut the word "sex" there, and we cut the word "fat." But I think if they don't fall, and we have a fabulous Nicely Johnson, but if they don't fall in love with them, I think you're doing something wrong. We did.
Yeah, and just wait till you see him as Peter, the nurse's servant in Romeo and Juliet. Yeah.
I have a question, but first a statement. When the trio come out, first of all, they immediately suck the audience in because they break that wall, and that's wonderful because they say, "Come on with us now. We're gonna do this for you," instead of keeping the wall there so that we are saying, "Oh, we're watching a play." My question is the music after. Who did that mixtape? And it's Barbara Streisand, and it's Dinah Shore, and Doris Day, and it's Harry Connick Jr. And who did the mixtape, and who's the other man?
That's so interesting. Someone else asked me that question yesterday, and I was gonna figure it out. Is it Bing Crosby? I haven't listened to
said
all of the
Bing
exit
Crosby,
music
but
yet.
the dates
I will
kinda-
find out. Greg Coffin, our music director, again, as we were wrestling with the fact that we're using recorded music, it didn't feel right to just play the traditional exit music that would come from a pit, which is often the time when audience members go to the orchestra pit to observe that. So we wanted to embrace the reality of our production. And Greg just a couple weeks ago said, "What if we do all the covers of Guys and Dolls, since there's so many fabulous covers?" And then, because for a while we thought, well, we just won't do exit music, but leaving a musical, you want the energy of that as you leave the theater. So, but several people have said, "Who is the man?" And so you hear Harry Connick, you hear Bing, is that right? That the Bing is the one you don't know. Yeah. I'll find out and I'll make them put it on their Facebook page and you can go find it.
I know you want to shy away from not having a live orchestra, but you hinted there were several reasons. I'm wondering, is it just follow the money?
For the orchestra?
Yeah, for the orchestra.
I think, and to be honest, I can't answer that question entirely because I'm not the producer, but a lot of it was money that, you know, they're bringing in musicians from all over the country, housing them for a very long period of time. Also, this score is a very demanding score because it's an old-fashioned musical in a lot of ways. So all the romantic stuff, you want full strings. You want the full string complement that you would get with Rodgers and Hammerstein. But it has all of the energy of a high brass orchestra. All the dance numbers want a lot of brass that the Rodgers and Hammerstein didn't do. So to get both of those worlds, we would have been looking at, and that's been reorchestrated numerous times. We worked from the original orchestration and umped the brass and the percussion in it from the original. If you're familiar with the 92 revival with Nathan Lane and Faith Prince, that was a very brass heavy orchestration. And we wanted that brass. We wanted the high energy of the brass, but we didn't want to give up the romance of the strings. And so versus 9 instruments, which is, typically what they'd probably be able to afford here, we actually have, I think, 29 instrumentalists from Chicago strings, brass, all of them. And so it certainly is a trade-off. And I'm not a fan of recorded music, but in this case, with what this show calls for, you would have lost a lot of the dynamic in the sound had we had to reduce it to 8 or 9.
I was wondering how we saw your show yesterday, and how did we do in relation to your notes as to any changes you made or will make because of what we thought was funny and what we thought wasn't funny.
Great question. You were great. You made it through your first audition with flying colors. In a musical, and I do musicals, opera, straight plays. A musical, the first preview it's so important. For me, much more important than in a play. You can kind of assess like, ooh, they're feeling a little bit, they're losing their focus a little bit here. They didn't laugh at that moment. But in a musical, you are a scene partner. Number one, you clap. You won't clap inside As You Like It unless there's really a great bit or something, right? But there's an art to making you clap when we want you to clap. The lights have to do something, the actors have to stop moving, the lights need to shift, and the music needs what we call a good button on it. And so we've been obsessing about a moment, the end of the Havana sequence. And you clapped, which is great, but we knew it was going to be a hard applause to get because there's not a good button on the music. We've done something a little bit strange with it. We've shifted the location. We've ended the Havana sequence with Sky and Sarah going to a new location. So we're not applauding for the 25 people we just saw dance for
That
us.
fabulous dance
Right?
number.
Yeah. We're actually going to this really intimate moment and we're having the two of them kiss.
I loved it.
Well, thank you. But so we're taking a risk there. And then, but I need you to clap for one very important reason. The writers have not given Sarah any time to breathe. She sits at a table and then she has to do a big dance number. She's got to knock a guy out with a punch. Guy's got to pick her up. You can't breathe very well when you're in a fireman's carry. And then she's got to come on and sing a 3.5-minute ballad, If I Were a Bell. And If I Were a Bell is normally done much simpler, where she kind of stands and sings it. And I wanted it to be much more physical. I wanted her to see a Sarah we have not seen before. Until then, Sarah always has her arms crossed, her coat's always buttoned up. I wanted her to be dancing. I wanted her to be falling on the floor.
And very tipsy.
And so she needs time to breathe. So those 5-6 seconds when you're clapping are gold for Sarah. Yeah. So we're still finessing that. And in the orchestration, we're going to go back in and we just need a little bump from the bass that honors what the lights are doing. Because you did eventually clap, but it wasn't an impulsive, unanimous clap. So
we needed a cue.
You needed a cue. You needed to be told. So we also are having them kiss at that moment because we want them to kiss. And so that's going to move us towards an applause. So things like that will continue to make changes. Also this piece, the comedy of it, often the book goes laugh, another line laugh, versus kind of the setup, joke. That would be typical in certainly musical comedy rhythm. He'll often go setup, joke, or setup, joke. And sometimes you got to give up one of those laughs because you're not going to get all three. And I said to the stage manager yesterday, I said, I want to make sure these people still like each other 2 months from now when they're closing the show, because sometimes you're going to rush your line to get the laugh, robbing the person of the laugh before. And actors,
they don't like that.
They don't like to give up a laugh. So part of our job now the next week will be navigating what laughs do we give up. And that we're really clear on that, because I do want to make sure that they like each other in 6 weeks.
Okay, some more questions.
I was thinking that I had never seen Sarah so tipsy before, and that was an interesting touch, I thought, to
to illustrate how different she had become during the Cuban sequence, and thought that was a great choice. I love the sight gag you had when Big Julie came on stage. I'm not sure how tall James Newcomb is, but a lasting memory I have of him is probably about 20 years ago at Oregon Shakespeare when he was portraying Richard III.
Oh, that was a great show.
And
I saw that
it was
show.
remarkable.
Yeah.
And they dared, for his first entrance, they dared to have him, they opened up the back of the stage, and they dared to have him come from, the inner part of the stage. And here's this rather small man coming out to play Richard III, and he had an expression on his face that made it quite clear that he was Richard III, and you had no doubt that the part was in good hands. But that was a great sight gag, hiding in behind other members of the cast, and then here's Big Julie, and not real big. Anyway, that was a good touch.
Good, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, there's still a couple people still
Having
around.
that last discussion, I have never felt so manipulated as an audience member. I don't know whether I'm happy or sad or whether I'm pleased to be part of the production. I thought it was exceptionally well done, and grateful that you would include us. So, I was particularly interested in the costuming on this one. It was just marvelous, and it was fun to watch.
Costumer's still here.
It almost reminded me of the Dick Tracy and the chromatic coloring type things of that movie that they did several years ago. But the costumes and the scenery were absolutely marvelous. I thought that was a nice touch and added wonderfully to it. Just a couple of comments.
Do we want to comment from our costume designer?
Our costumes are sitting
Here?
right behind you,
All right.
and you're absolutely right. He's fabulous.
I'm going
Kevin
to hand
Albert.
the microphone
Yes.
to
Since he's in
you
the
don't mind
house,
being
let's take
thrown
advantage.
in right away.
I was trying to hide.
Sorry about that. No hiding here.
Wearing Dick Tracy yellow shorts, actually.
Yes, you
Wonderful.
guys here.
This is a perfect show for me because I love bright colors. But no, it was interesting when Peter and I first started talking way back in December, October, whatever it was. He said he didn't want to play with the period, that he wanted to be true to the original production, but we wanted to really heighten the reality of it. So if something is red, it is really red. If, we played with as much bright color as you could. And it's funny you mentioned the Dick Tracy coat, because originally that coat was just a regular tan trench coat at first dress. And Peter said he doesn't fit into our world. He looks real, and everything else is so intensely colored. So we took it and dyed it, and it came out that kind of yellowy green color to fit into our hyper world. So thank you.
The biggest challenge for me with the design of Guys and Dolls is it takes place just over 2 days, which means you have to have scenes during the day. But when we think of Broadway, we don't think of 10 in the morning, right? We think of 10 at night, right? We think of the marquees. We think of the glitz and the glam of Broadway that happens when the sun goes down. And so early on, the lighting designer and I said, okay, are we going to honor time of day to help tell the story? And we thought we're going to let the text do that, and we're just going to go saturate color the whole time, because again, it's a fable. And if you say Broadway and you ask someone to imagine, most people aren't going to imagine 10 in the morning. They're going to imagine 10 at night. And so that's the biggest challenge, actually, is to honor time of day, but to give it what we want it to look like, which is an electric Broadway versus a sunshine Broadway.
We have a question.
And
back
then
there.
there's a question at the back, and then we'll come up here in the front.
Great, thank you, Peter. I want to say it's hard to believe, I think, for most of us that was a preview, okay, because it was such an outstanding event. It really was. And a couple of questions. I'd like to get, hopefully you agree, like we as the audience, the reaction that you received on your first audience, the presentation, and did it all fall into place? Maybe there's a few fixes here. And then I think I'd like you to address the production value. I think we've familiar with the movie. Some of us are familiar with the play back in the 50s, but I'd like to get your opinion. I think the production value was tremendous, the way you moved everybody around, the scenery and everything to that moment. Can you address that?
Thank you. It was a thrilling first preview for us. We've had 5, 6, 10 people in the room with us at most as we've gone along, and most of those people have seen it numerous times, so they're not laughing at the jokes anymore, and they're not applauding when we want you to applaud. So so you are a scene partner in a musical, and that was thrilling yesterday, I think,
You
for
could
all of
really
us.
see the actors
Yeah,
really thriving on
absolutely.
that, Brian, and the rest of the cast were just beaming
Yeah.
in a way that is not an actor smiling because the director said, okay, smile through this whole scene, right? It's
When
really
we
great.
think of theater as a collaborative art, we think about collaboration in the rehearsal room, that we have actors, we have designers, we have directors, we have dramaturg, but it's also collaborative in the audience. Theater doesn't exist without the audience.
Okay, so there's a question
Production
here.
values,
There's
just
two.
quickly, you wanted to,
Oh,
he
yeah.
asked about production values.
and then 2 questions in the front.
Great. So, I think you certainly could do Guys and Dolls with a $10 million scenic budget. You certainly it could support that, the razzle dazzle of that. Very often I start a process with the designer, a set designer in particular, saying, if there is a container that the entire story can live in, what would that container be? So we may go inside a mission, we may go down into a sewer, but I personally think the theater is best when the audience completes the picture. When we instigate a picture, but we leave negative space for the audience to complete it. Film and television can't do that. There's so much that film and television can do that we will never be able to do. But what they can't do, I don't believe, is it's hard to create a container in a film. So yesterday, very little changed. That you went a dozen different places, right? The sewer, when we became the sewer, you had been looking at a fraction of it all night long, right? It's just now you saw the rest of it and it was a sewer for you. In a movie, you would have just gone to the sewer, right? It doesn't exist on either a more metaphorical plane or a plane that just says, this is the container for our story. And what triggers do we need for the audience to go where we need them to go? So that was the fun of this. The biggest challenge with Guys and Dolls is it is New York, but then you got to go to Havana in the middle of an act. And so how do you go to Havana? And to be honest, we had a whole Havana set designed that was cut in the budget process, which is always a great thing for a team, actually. The budget process in the theater, I think your limitations are always your greatest source of inspiration. And what's the difference between being in Times Square and then going to a tropical island? Well, there's air, there's sky. And at one point I said, let's just cut the entire Havana set. And we can actually feel like we're leaving the oppression of New York City, the buildings that are looming in. And so we actually cut the whole Havana set and then just added a few gestures to take us there, because I think and in some ways, I think it's a more successful than bringing in the same heavy weighted scenery that we had been living in Times Square all night.
I think we're here first.
I'm going back to the audience reaction to Nicely Nicely Johnson. I saw Stubby K do that in the 50s in San Francisco, and he brought the house down and he did 3 repeats of the song standing there, and I mean nobody was ready for him to stop, so keep him going.
It's hard to ruin
Oh,
that song,
Stubby
right?
K.
Sit down, you're rocking the boat. From high school to professional, that thing works. Yeah.
The great thing about Guys and Dolls is, as a show, I think it's like a Midsummer Night's Dream. It is that play, which, if you're lucky enough, or who's going to the show this afternoon? Yeah, Midsummer Night's Dream, I believe is a foolproof comedy, right? 4th graders can put it on, and guess what? It's funny when 4th graders put it on, and it's fabulous when professionals put it on. It's wonderful, wonderful stuff.
Jack Vertel in this new book that just came out actually compares Guys and Dolls to Midsummer Night's Dream,
Well,
because he actually says, it's a series of comedic misadventures heading towards a double wedding. And the audience knows early on in the narrative that they're heading towards this double wedding. And just, how are we going to get there?
mhm.
And that it's Midsummer Night's Dream. Yeah.
Okay, in the front here.
Okay, this is just. Is this
You're on. You're good.
Okay, this is just a comment about Mr. Newcomb. This is something that we followed up on after Coriolanus a few years ago. He's really 6 feet tall. The rest of it's just acting.
Right.
As Kate likes to say, your laugh line is,
Yeah.
she's tall on the inside.
Yeah, I'm taller on the inside. I'm very tall on the inside. I might be 5'4" on the outside, very tall on the inside. Let's see.
Over
And you
here.
had a question, or
Over here
No.
to the left.
to the left? Yes, sir.
first a comment. I think you found another Judy Garland. I'm like, is she reincarnated or what? She's just fabulous. My question was, it's headed to a double wedding, but you don't do a double wedding. How come?
Do you mean why don't we see them both get married on stage at the end? Yeah, that's how it's written. Because there's the one line, I married Sarah and Sky on the Mission myself. So that's actually, yeah, how it's written, that it's Nathan and Adelaide's wedding day, but Sky and Sarah have already, and how they arrived at that, I'm not sure. I think probably there's great payoff seeing Sky wearing a Mission uniform.
Totally.
And he probably wouldn't wear that to his wedding day. So I'm guessing that was the visual payoff of why they didn't do the double wedding. But
it's rooted in a kind of fact. The Salvation Army was developed in England in the 1880s, came over to New York, allowed women these positions of power and authority, but they really valued having couples. And so it seems like they're really looking at that particular trope of the Salvation Army, that they like to have couples.
The other interesting thing, of course, is that the Salvation Army used music and song as a part of their shtick on the street to attract people to their discussions so that they could preach the gospel that they were wanting to promote. And so that part, I mean, the Salvation Army is itself a piece of musical theater with a very, important for them, very moral core to it, but it is musical theater. Absolutely.
He changes the name, but essentially it's the Salvation Army.
Save a Soul
Lindy's,
Mission,
that
Salvation
kind of
Army.
stuff.
yeah. And it was quite late in the process, actually. If there's actually a heavy in the musical, it's not Big Julie. The heavy is General Cartwright from the Salvation Army. It's a woman who actually holds all the keys, because it's all based upon this notion of this bet with the threat of the mission being shut down. And she has less than a dozen lines in the whole show, but she's the heavy. And it was quite late in the process that I said to the dramaturg, could it be logical that she could be from Britain, knowing that the Salvation Army was given birth in Britain? She said, it is feasible. And so quite late in the process, we gave Cartwright a British accent just to give her more power, to make her stand out more from the rest. But actually the real power in the room is not the gangster from Chicago with a gun. It's the old lady from Britain.
Yeah, and that unusual dialect makes her different than the rest of the
Exactly.
main character. She stands apart in that way.
Exactly.
What's your feeling on the actors and actresses exiting into the audience?
So I think, that's part of the, it's part of the glory of the thrust stage, is that it's sculptural in that way. It's three-dimensional in a way that the proscenium is not. This is a quirky space because it's really 85% proscenium and 15% a thrust. It's got that deep apron. And I guess for years they didn't use those VOMs, the ramps down off the front of the stage here, because they're very, very steep. So we had to be very strategic. When women in heels can't go up and down those VOMs, they're very, very steep. So we had to be kind of strategic when we used them. But whether you noticed or not, but Runyon Land, the opening, which is where I was really interested in breaking down this wall. The three guys come and look at, come break down that wall, acknowledge the
You have
audience.
the Salvation Army come down
And then the
march.
Salvation Army in that opening. So that
Save a Soul
opening, it
Mission.
took it down. But as we got into the narrative, I felt like I needed people to stay inside the world of the story, not inside the world of the theater. So we were quite strategic. We used the VOMs in those points of entry, saying to the audience, we're all in the room together, let's go on a journey together. But then once the narrative was the train was out of the gate, so to speak, or out of the station, then I didn't use the VOMs as much.
I think we have time for maybe one or two.
What's your next project? I think he's asking.
Oh, I head right to New York to cast a couple projects. Next up is I'm doing a production. The production I created of Ragtime in Minneapolis is going to Seattle and then to Oslo Rep in Florida. So I'm casting that production. And then my company does a New Works Festival where we workshop new musicals. And so we'll be workshopping two new musicals and a play with music in July.
She's got it. And then we'll move over here.
Oh, I just couldn't let this end without commenting on Alexandra Zorn's voice. It's bigger than she is. It was absolutely incredible. I couldn't believe that she could produce a sound like that. It was beautiful.
You know what? One thing that's unusual about working in a rep situation. I've never worked at a repertory theater before, other than I started my career as an assistant at the Guthrie Theater, and there was a repertory company then. But as a director, I haven't worked in a rep company, and so not until day one of rehearsal did I actually meet most of my actors, which as a director is a bit unnerving because we're used to controlling that casting process. And so I was thrilled when I met them all, but they were having trouble finding a Sarah. And I said, I know exactly who should do it. Alexandra, right out of college, played Lori in Oklahoma for me at the Fifth Avenue in Seattle. And I said, you gotta hear Alexandra Zorn because I think she's our Sarah. So
Great. We have a question over here.
I also thought your Adelaide was remarkable. And I wondered, you know, as the lament comes, of course, we're all like, okay, a mountain to climb, right? We all have concepts of how this should, how it will go or have seen. Um, how how much did you coach her? I just loved, there were certain things when the recording in interludes, she would, you know, touch her throat, touch her ear. How many of those choices, they were awesome choices and things she did things physically that I've never seen an Adelaide do. Or did you help coach her with those, or?
Yeah, Melinda's a fantastic actress, and for those who have been coming to the festival have seen her Rosalind and her, you know, we'll see her in Titania. She's an extraordinary actress. I think the biggest challenge, and I have not actually told this to her, is she is so wicked smart, and Adelaide is not.
Yeah.
But Adelaide's got a heart that's bigger than that room, right? Adelaide is all heart.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest challenge with Melinda was
Dumb
to
it
let
down.
herself not be so smart and be all heart. But Melinda also did something early on. We were working on Sumi, their duet in Act 2 between Nathan and Adelaide. And normally it stays comedy throughout, and it ends with the two of them on stage together in some comedic pose. And as he's doing, I said, you know what? After you say, I could honestly die, just leave. Just leave him. Because I think we want the audience to wonder, are they going to get together or not? We
Some
know we
dramatic
bought a ticket to
tension.
a musical comedy. We're pretty sure, but we want the audience to be left hanging there. And Melinda said, great. And she completely broke down into tears on I Could Honestly Die, and then left Nathan standing there. And I've never seen the number done that way before. And it breaks my heart. And I think Adelaide is really good at making people laugh. I don't think she's always broken people's hearts. And I think Melinda's really special in that way.
I think you really found the heart in this production and in these characters, that particularly those moments that are there for them. We perhaps have time for one more question if there's someone who hasn't had a chance to comment or speak.
Anybody? Okay, over here.
I just have to make a small comment about the overture. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. It was fantastic.
Well, Christine Ryan, our choreographer, really takes the credit for that. They do in the script give you some stage directions of what characters, and we did about half of them. And then the other half, we said there was a paper doll seller, there was a boxer, there were things that don't necessarily, I didn't think, resonate as much in 2017. And because the piece is about people from polar opposites coming together, New York is a very ecumenical city. So I said, you know, how do we Runyonize, right? So how do we let's put a rabbi and a student, let's put a nun, but what's surprising about them? And a nun on a bike is more surprising than a nun carrying a Bible, right? So how do you kind of capture those kind of
And a bit with a dog.
qualities? And the bit with the dog.
Which is
So-
our homage to Shakespeare in Love.
Yes. So we created those characters, are not necessarily part of the original Runyon Land, but perhaps resonate with the contemporary audience.
All right, so we're at the end of our time. Let me just let you know, we did live stream this today. If you would like to hear this discussion again, you can go online to the Utah Shakespeare Festival education page and check out this talk. All the other director talks are being archived as well if you're not able to make them. I would like us just to thank this remarkable director, both for his time today and for this beautiful production.
Thank you. Thank you. Have fun.
And thank you all. Hopefully we'll see you this afternoon at Midsummer Night's Dream. And tonight at
8 o'clock is Shakespeare in Love. And then tomorrow
for
morning,
the seminars.
Tomorrow morning, we'll be discussing A Midsummer Night's Dream at 9 a.m. And Midsummer Night's Dream at 10 a.m. in this very spot.
Shakespeare in Love. We're getting it.
Shakespeare
We're
in
in
Love.
previews too.
I'll get
Thanks,
it.
everyone. See you.